Hey everyone, today we're tackling a question that sits at the exact intersection of power, spectacle and scandal. What a Roman empress did to the chosen gladiators that was worse than death. Now, if you clicked on this expecting a straightforward tale of arena brutality, buckle up, because the truth is stranger, messier, and far more revealing about how imperial power actually worked in ancient Rome. Picture this. The marble corridors of the imperial palace, blood still under the fingernails of men who killed for entertainment just hours earlier, now summoned not to fight but to perform an entirely different role. And here's the thing, death in the arena? That was clean. That was honorable in its own twisted way. What happened behind palace doors was something else entirely. We're talking about Faustina the Younger, wife of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius. You know Marcus, the Stoic, the guy who wrote Meditations, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors. Model ruler, thoughtful leader, platonic ideal of the enlightened monarch. His wife? Well, ancient biographers painted a very different picture. And if you appreciate history that refuses to airbrush imperial dysfunction, go ahead and subscribe, because we're diving deep into the machinery of rumor, power, and the strange social physics of the Roman court. So let's get the core allegation on the table. Hostile sources, writing decades after Faustina's death, often with political axes to grind, claim that Faustina the Younger had a particular appetite for gladiators, not as spectators in the stands, but as private companions, that she would hand-pick fighters from the arena, summon them to the palace, and keep them in a rotation that scandalized Rome's elite. The kicker, Marcus Aurelius supposedly knew, and according to these same sources, he did something about it that managed to be both cruel and coldly pragmatic in equal measure. Now here's where we pump the brakes. Ancient Roman biography is not investigative journalism. It's character assassination as literary genre. The main source for this story is the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies written in the late 4th century, roughly 2 centuries after Faustina lived. 2 centuries. That's like someone today writing a scandalous tell-all about Benjamin Franklin based entirely on rumors. The Historia Augusta is notorious for inventing dialogue, fabricating documents and mixing real events with pure fiction. Scholars have spent lifetimes trying to figure out which parts are remotely reliable. So when it tells us Faustina was insatiable, that she bathed in gladiator blood on a physician's advice, that Marcus had her lovers executed in front of her, we're reading propaganda, not evidence, but here's the fascinating part. The story stuck. For centuries, Faustina became the archetype of the depraved empress, the woman who couldn't be satisfied by philosophy or imperial dignity, who needed the raw violence of the arena brought into her bedroom. Why? Because Roman society was obsessed with female sexuality as a threat to order. An empress sleeping with gladiators wasn't just adultery, it was cosmic inversion. Gladiators were infames, legally disgraced, stripped of citizen rights, considered barely human. They were property, entertainment, instruments. For an empress, pinnacle of Roman respectability, to desire them inverted every social hierarchy Rome held sacred. So who was Faustina the Younger, before the rumors turned her into a cautionary tale? Born around the year 130 of the Common Era, she was Roman royalty from birth. Her father was Antoninus Pius, who would become emperor. Her mother was Faustina the Elder, herself the subject of posthumous sexual gossip. Faustina the Younger was raised in the imperial household, educated in Greek and Latin, trained in the performative dignity required of elite Roman women. At around 15 years old, she was married to her cousin Marcus Aurelius, a strategic dynastic match that tied together 2 branches of the Antonine family. Here's what we know for certain. Faustina and Marcus had at least 13 children together. 13. She traveled with him on military campaigns to the Danube frontier, living in military camps, enduring harsh conditions that would have killed most aristocratic Romans. When she died in the year 175, Marcus was devastated. He deified her immediately, struck coins in her honor, established a charitable foundation for orphaned girls in her name, and wrote in his private journals about her loyalty and virtue. None of that squares with the portrait of a woman so depraved her husband had to murder her lovers in front of her. But let's follow the allegations as they were written, because they reveal how Roman political gossip functioned as statecraft. The Historia Augusta claims that Faustina became inflamed with passion for gladiators after watching the games, that she would send for specific fighters, have them brought to the palace at night and keep them until she grew bored. The text doesn't specify what happened during these encounters, thankfully, because it's not interested in documenting reality. It's interested in moral degradation as narrative device. The important detail is the type of man: gladiators. Not senators, not generals, not even handsome slaves from respectable households. Men who killed for applause, whose bodies were scarred, who smelled of blood and sand and the crowd's ugly joy. Why gladiators specifically? Because in the Roman moral imagination, gladiators occupied a uniquely contaminated category. They were simultaneously idolized and reviled. Women screamed for them in the stands, scratched their names into walls, collected their sweat as aphrodisiacs. But legally, socially, they were infames, marked by disgrace. Appearing in the arena meant losing your citizenship rights. You couldn't vote, testify in court, or marry a freeborn Roman. You were a body that existed to absorb violence and dispense death. The Romans loved gladiators the way people love car crashes. With horrified fascination and absolute certainty, they would never trade places. So when hostile biographers wanted to destroy Faustina's reputation, they didn't claim she slept with senators or poets. They claimed she craved gladiators, men so low on the social ladder that desiring them was pathological, a sickness of the soul. It wasn't just adultery, it was bestiality with a human face. And here's the genius of the rumor: it made Marcus Aurelius look worse. The philosopher king, master of self-control, couldn't control his own wife. His stoic virtue was a joke if his household was a circus. The gossip didn't just attack Faustina, it undermined the entire ideological foundation of Marcus's reign. Now let's talk about what allegedly happened when Marcus found out. According to the Historia Augusta, Marcus consulted wise men, philosophers, physicians, perhaps priests. He was in an impossible position. Divorce would be political suicide. Faustina's father had been emperor. Her family connections were the bedrock of Marcus's legitimacy. Executing her outright would spark civil war, but ignoring it, that would make him a cuckold, a joke, the butt of every tavern song in Rome. So the advisors supposedly came up with a solution that was equal parts magical thinking and sadistic theater. The story goes like this. Faustina was told to confess her desires to Marcus in private. Then, in front of her, the gladiators she had supposedly chosen were brought into the palace and killed. Not in the arena, not with honor or ceremony, but butchered like livestock. After they were dead, Faustina was forced to bathe in their blood while it was still warm. Then, still covered in blood, she was to have intercourse with Marcus. The logic, according to the alleged physicians, was sympathetic magic. The blood of the gladiators would transfer their masculine virtues to Marcus, curing Faustina of her unnatural desires and ensuring that any child conceived would inherit strength rather than depravity. Let's be absolutely clear. This is fantasy. Revenge fantasy, maybe, or just the kind of grotesque narrative that made Roman readers feel morally superior while secretly enjoying the scandal. No contemporary source mentions it. No inscription, no letter, no hostile senator ranting in the forum. It appears for the first time 2 centuries later in a text that also claims Emperor Elagabalus married a Vestal virgin and installed a giant phallic statue in the palace. The Historia Augusta is fan fiction, not history. But the story tells us something true about Roman anxieties. Blood rituals were real. Roman religion was soaked in animal sacrifice, and medical theory included uses for human and animal blood. The idea that bathing in blood could cure disease or transfer qualities wasn't ridiculous to ancient ears, it was folk medicine. But using the blood of executed gladiators specifically, that's where magic becomes punishment. The men are killed not because they're guilty, they probably never existed, but because their deaths symbolically restore order. They're scapegoats, in the most literal sense. Their blood washes away the Empress's transgression, Their deaths erase the inversion of hierarchy. And Faustina? She's not just punished, she's humiliated, reduced to a passive body that must absorb violence before resuming her proper role. The whole narrative is about restoring Marcus's control over his wife, over his household, over the symbolic order of Rome itself. Whether any of it happened is irrelevant. The story does its work by existing, by being repeated, by shaping how later generations understood imperial power and female sexuality. So where does the allegation actually come from? Why invent this specific story about this specific empress? To answer that, we have to zoom out and look at the pattern. Faustina the Younger wasn't the first empress accused of sexual depravity, and she wouldn't be the last. Messalina, wife of Claudius, was said to have competed with prostitutes to see who could service more men in a night. Agrippina the Younger allegedly seduced her own son, Nero. Julia, daughter of Augustus, was exiled for adultery so prolific it became a state scandal. Notice the pattern? Empresses, women with actual political power, get rewritten as sexual monsters. This isn't coincidence, it's Roman political discourse. Women in the imperial family had no official role in government. They couldn't hold office, command armies, or address the Senate. But they had influence through their husbands, their sons, their family networks. That influence was informal, which made it terrifying to Roman men raised on the idea that legitimate power must be public, visible, and male. So the way you attacked a powerful woman wasn't by critiquing her policies. She had none, officially, but by attacking her sexual conduct. Destroy her reputation and you destroy her family's legitimacy. Faustina was particularly vulnerable to this because of who her husband was. Marcus Aurelius wasn't just an emperor. He was a philosopher, the living embodiment of Stoic virtue. His reign was supposed to prove that reason could govern Rome better than ambition or cruelty. But Stoicism had a problem. It preached self-control, mastery over passion, indifference to external circumstances. If Marcus couldn't even control his own wife's alleged desires, what did that say about his philosophy? The rumors about Faustina weren't really about her. They were attacks on Marcus's entire intellectual project. And here's where it gets darkly funny. Marcus probably helped create the rumors. Not intentionally, but through his own actions. After Faustina died in the year 175, Marcus went overboard with honors. He deified her, built temples, struck coins calling her Mother of the Camp and Mother of the Senate. He wrote about her constantly in his meditations, insisting on her virtue and loyalty. To a cynical Roman audience, and Romans were very cynical about imperial propaganda, this looked defensive. Why so insistent? What was he trying to cover up? The more Marcus praised Faustina, the more people whispered that he was protesting too much. Tell me in the comments, do you think the rumors about Faustina say more about her, or about the men who wrote them down centuries later? Let's talk about gladiators themselves for a moment, because understanding what they actually were makes the allegation even more revealing. Gladiators were not, as popular culture often suggests, criminals or prisoners thrown into the arena to die. Some were, sure, condemned criminals, prisoners of war, enslaved people sold into the trade, but many gladiators were volunteers. Free men who signed contracts, took an oath auctoramentum, and legally enslaved themselves to a lanista, a gladiator trainer, in exchange for food, housing, medical care, and the possibility of fame. Why would anyone do this? Because Roman society offered very few paths to glory for poor men. You couldn't vote your way into power. Elections were controlled by aristocrats. You couldn't buy your way up. Wealth required land or trade connections most people didn't have. But in the arena, a talented fighter could become a celebrity. Graffiti in Pompeii called specific gladiators the delight of women and the glory of girls. Successful fighters earned prize money, endorsements, and sometimes freedom. A few became wealthy enough to retire, buy property, even train the next generation. But the cost was enormous. Gladiators trained in ludi, barracks that were part military camp, part prison. They ate a high-carbohydrate diet designed to build fat over muscle, not for strength, but so cuts would bleed dramatically without hitting vital organs quickly. They learned to fight in specific styles. Murmillo with a large shield and short sword, Ritiarius with a net and trident, thraex with a curved blade. They fought rarely, maybe 5 or 6 times a year, because they were expensive to train and replace. Most bouts didn't end in death. A fighter who showed skill and courage could surrender and be spared by the sponsor of the games. But here's the key point. No matter how famous, how skilled, how beloved by the crowd, a gladiator was infamous, disgraced. A magistrate could legally torture a gladiator for testimony without trial. A gladiator couldn't marry a senator's daughter, even if he won his freedom. Even retired gladiators carried the stain. Roman law treated gladiators the way it treated actors, pimps, and prostitutes, as people who had willingly debased themselves by making their bodies into public entertainment. They were admired the way pornography is admired. Everyone consumed it. No one admitted it should be respected. So when the Historia Augusta claims Faustina desired gladiators, it's claiming she desired men legally categorized as human filth. Not because they were immoral, many gladiators lived by strict codes of honor, but because Roman law said their bodies were public property, degraded by spectacle. An empress sleeping with gladiators wasn't just scandalous, it was category violation, like a queen marrying a court jester. It broke the symbolic order that kept Roman hierarchy stable. Now, did Faustina actually have affairs with gladiators? Let's look at the evidence, or rather, the complete absence of evidence. We have coins struck during her lifetime. We have inscriptions dedicating monuments in her honor. We have letters between Marcus and his rhetoric teacher, Fronto, discussing family matters. We have Marcus's own meditations, written partially during Faustina's lifetime. None of them mention scandal. None of them suggest marital discord beyond the ordinary frustrations of family life. Marcus writes about Faustina with affection, sometimes with exasperation, always with the assumption that she shares his burdens. Contemporary historians don't mention it either. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, closer to the events, describes Faustina as politically active and occasionally criticized for luxury, but says nothing about sexual scandal. Herodian, writing around the same time, focuses on her public role and her children. The first time the gladiator story appears in the historical record is the Historia Augusta, written at least a century after the previous sources, at a time when the Antonine dynasty was distant memory and could be safely scandalized without political risk. But here's what we do know about Faustina from reliable sources. She was politically astute. She traveled with Marcus to the northern frontier during the Marcomannic Wars, living in military camps from around the year 170 to her death in 175. Roman matrons didn't do this. It was cold, dangerous, uncomfortable, and completely outside the traditional role of an aristocratic wife. But Faustina went, and the soldiers loved her for it. They called her Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camp. Coins celebrated her presence with the army. This wasn't a woman paralyzed by scandal. This was a woman performing imperial power in public, in hostile territory, with the full support of the legions. She also bore at least 13 children, possibly more. Pregnancy and childbirth in the ancient world were brutal and dangerous. The fact that Faustina survived that many pregnancies into her mid-40s is remarkable. It also makes the timing of the alleged affairs logically absurd. According to the Historia Augusta's own chronology, Faustina was supposedly conducting these affairs while pregnant, nursing, or recovering from childbirth for most of her adult life. When exactly was she supposed to have time for a rotating stable of gladiators? The answer, of course, is that she didn't. The story is a post-mortem character assassination, created by people who never knew her, writing for audiences who wanted to believe that imperial women were sexual grotesques. It's the same machinery that destroyed Messalina, Agrippina, and Julia. Find a powerful woman, invent sexual transgression, repeat until it becomes common knowledge. The truth doesn't matter, the narrative does. So if the gladiator story is fiction, why does it persist? Why do modern popular histories still repeat it, even with disclaimers? Because it's a good story. It has everything: sex, violence, imperial decadence, a philosophical emperor cuckolded by men who kill for entertainment. It confirms every suspicion people want to have about power, that the rich are depraved, that women with power are dangerous, that even philosopher kings can't escape human weakness. It's the kind of story that feels true because it feels inevitable. But there's something darker at work too. The story persists because it does cultural work. It teaches a lesson about female sexuality that patriarchal societies want taught. Women who transgress, who take lovers, who choose their own desires, who refuse to stay within the boundaries assigned to them, will be punished. Not just in life, but forever, in the stories told about them. Faustina has been paying for alleged crimes she almost certainly didn't commit for almost 2,000 years. Her coins show a dignified empress. Her monuments celebrate a loyal wife and mother. Her husband's own writings attest to her virtue. But ask most people today what they know about Faustina the Younger, and they'll tell you she slept with gladiators. This is how reputation works in history, not through evidence, but through repetition. The Historia Augusta invents a scandal. Medieval chroniclers repeat it because it makes a good sermon about female lust. Renaissance historians repeat it because it makes classical Rome look appropriately decadent. Modern popular historians repeat it because it gets clicks. At each iteration, the disclaimers get smaller and the story gets juicier until you're left with that Roman empress who bathed in gladiator blood. A detail so specific and grotesque it must be true, right? Wrong. Specific details don't make a story true. They make it memorable. The Historia Augusta knew this. It invented letters, forged documents, created dialogue between people who never met, all to make its inventions feel historical. Modern readers see the specificity, the blood, the gladiators, the cuckolded philosopher, and mistake detail for accuracy. But you can tell a lie in high resolution. You can describe something that never happened with cinematic precision. Roman biographers did it all the time. And here's the thing. Even if Faustina had conducted affairs with gladiators or anyone else, the story as told is still propaganda. Real adultery doesn't involve bathing in blood and magical cures. Real people don't confess their desires and then watch their lovers executed as performance art. The story is designed to be extreme, to strip Faustina of humanity and reduce her to a symbol. The depraved empress, the woman who couldn't be controlled, the dark mirror of her philosopher husband. It's not biography, it's mythology. Let's return to the title's premise. What a Roman empress did to the chosen gladiators was worse than death. If we accept the allegations as written, and to be clear, we shouldn't, the answer is still wrong. Faustina didn't do anything to the gladiators. According to the Historia Augusta, Marcus did. The gladiators were executed on his orders, their blood harvested for a ritual, their deaths framed as medical treatment for his wife's supposed illness. If we're keeping score, the philosopher-emperor is the one who allegedly ordered murders, not the empress. But that's the genius of the story's framing. It makes Faustina responsible for the violence done in her name. She desired the gladiators, therefore their deaths are her fault. Her sexuality becomes the crime. Their executions become the inevitable consequence. This is victim-blaming as historical method. The men who died, if they existed, died because a paranoid emperor needed to reassert control. But the story is written to make the empress the monster. And here's where the worse-than-death framing gets really insidious. It suggests that being desired by an empress was somehow more degrading than dying in the arena. Think about that. Gladiators died as public spectacle, their bodies torn apart for entertainment, their blood soaking into sand that would be raked over and reused the next day. They died knowing they were property, instruments, things, but being chosen by an empress, even as a scandalous secret, at least acknowledged them as human enough to desire. The story wants us to believe that intimacy with power is more shameful than anonymous slaughter. That's not history. That's ideology. The reality is that we don't know what happened to any specific gladiators in Faustina's household because there's no evidence any were there. The chosen gladiators are ghosts, invented by a hostile biographer 2 centuries later to make a moral point about female depravity. They have no names, no histories, no archaeological trace. They exist only as props in someone else's character assassination. So what do we actually know about Faustina the Younger? We know she was born into the imperial family and raised for dynastic marriage. We know she married Marcus Aurelius and bore him at least 13 children, including Commodus, who would become one of Rome's most infamous emperors. We know she traveled with Marcus to the frontier, lived in military camps, and earned the loyalty of the legions. We know Marcus loved her enough to deify her after her death and spend years defending her reputation in writing. We know she was commemorated on coins and monuments across the empire. We know that hostile sources, writing long after her death, accused her of sexual misconduct, specifically with gladiators, the most transgressive choice possible in Roman moral terms. We know these accusations appear nowhere in contemporary sources. We know the main source for the blood-bathing story is the Historia Augusta, a text so unreliable that scholars debate whether it was written by one forger or several. We know that similar accusations were leveled at almost every powerful imperial woman, suggesting a pattern of gendered political attack rather than actual pattern of behavior. What we don't know, and can never know, is whether Faustina had affairs with gladiators or anyone else. The evidence simply doesn't exist. We can't subpoena witnesses who've been dead for 2 millennia. We can't examine DNA or check hotel records or pull up text messages. All we have are texts, and texts in the ancient world were political instruments, not neutral records. They were written by people with agendas, copied by people with different agendas, and read by people who brought their own assumptions to the page. So the responsible historical answer is, we don't know, and the sources that claim to know are demonstrably unreliable. But that's a deeply unsatisfying answer, isn't it? People want certainty. They want to know if the scandalous story is true, and in the absence of certainty, they'll usually choose the juicier narrative. That's why the Gladiator story survives. Not because it's true, but because it's interesting. Here's what's genuinely tragic about the Faustina story. It has completely overshadowed everything else about her life. She was a woman who redefined the role of Empress, who traveled with armies, who gave birth to future emperors, who managed the complex politics of the imperial household during a period of constant military crisis. She was present for the Marcomannic Wars, the Antonine Plague, the constant pressure on Rome's northern frontiers. She raised children who would shape the next generation of Roman politics. She was, by any measure, a significant historical figure. But ask most people what they know about her, and they'll tell you about gladiators. The rumor has eaten her actual biography. We've reduced a complex human being to a single salacious allegation, and in doing so, we've let hostile ancient biographers win. They wanted to destroy her reputation. We've helped them do it by repeating their lies for entertainment. This is the real crime of the Historia Augusta and texts like it. They don't just invent scandals, they erase real history. Every time someone repeats the gladiator story without context, Faustina loses a little more of her actual life. The woman who earned the title Mother of the Camp disappears behind the caricature of the insatiable Empress. The mother of 13 children becomes a one-dimensional sexual deviant. The partner who traveled through war zones with her husband becomes a punchline. And the gladiators, the alleged victims of her supposed desires, become props in a morality play that has nothing to do with their actual lives. Real gladiators were complex people. Some criminals, some volunteers, some enslaved, some famous, some forgotten. They had families, ambitions, fears, and skills. They deserve better than to be reduced to anonymous bodies in someone else's revenge fantasy. The broader lesson here is about how we read ancient sources and what we choose to believe. The Romans left us incredible records, laws, letters, inscriptions, architecture, art. But they also left us gossip, propaganda, and outright fiction disguised as history. Learning to tell the difference is critical, and it requires asking uncomfortable questions. Who wrote this? When? For what audience? With what agenda? What evidence supports it beyond the text itself? When we apply those questions to the Faustina story, it collapses. The source is late, hostile, and demonstrably unreliable. The allegations are absent from contemporary accounts. The details, bloodbathing, magical cures, synchronized executions, are fantasy, not documentation. The pattern matches known examples of gendered political attack, not unique transgression. Nothing about the story holds up to scrutiny. But here's the hard part. Even knowing all this, the story is still emotionally compelling. It taps into deep anxieties about power, sexuality, and control that transcend time and culture. The idea of a woman in power pursuing forbidden desires, of a philosopher unable to control his own household, of men dying for transgressing invisible boundaries, these are archetypal narratives that feel true even when they're false, and that's why they persist. The challenge for anyone interested in history is to resist the emotional pull of a good story and demand actual evidence. It's less fun, it's less dramatic. It produces answers like, "We don't know," and the sources are unreliable, instead of vivid scenes of blood and betrayal. But it's honest, and in the long run, honesty serves history better than scandal. Faustina the Younger deserves to be remembered for what she actually did. Partnered with one of Rome's most important emperors, raised the next generation of imperial leadership, redefined what an empress could do by going to the frontier, and earned genuine loyalty from soldiers who called her their mother. That's a remarkable life that's worth remembering. The Gladiator story. That's just noise, centuries of noise drowning out the signal. So what did a Roman empress do to the chosen gladiators that was worse than death? According to the most reliable evidence we have, nothing. The chosen gladiators never existed outside the imagination of a hostile biographer writing 200 years after the fact. The story is fiction, politically motivated, morally instructive fiction designed to teach lessons about female sexuality and imperial power that Roman society wanted taught. But the story's persistence teaches us something real, that reputation, once destroyed, is almost impossible to restore. Faustina has been defending herself for 2,000 years, and she's losing, not because the evidence is against her, there is no evidence, but because people prefer scandalous lies to boring truth. We want to believe that empresses were depraved, that philosophers were hypocrites, that power inevitably corrupts. The Gladiator story gives us all of that in one tidy package. The real tragedy isn't what Faustina allegedly did to gladiators. It's what centuries of historians and popular writers have done to Faustina. Reduced her to a sexual caricature, stripped her of complexity and humanity, and used her as a prop to make points about female depravity that have nothing to do with who she actually was. That's the crime that's worse than death, the slow erasure of a human being's actual life, replaced by a grotesque fiction that serves everyone's purposes except the truth. If you've made it this far and want more deep dives into the machinery of historical reputation and the difference between ancient propaganda and actual evidence, subscribe and drop a comment about which imperial figures you want examined next, because Rome had no shortage of people destroyed by rumor. And remember, when you read history, especially ancient history, always ask who's telling the story and what they get out of you believing it. Sometimes the most revealing part of an allegation isn't whether it's true, it's why someone wanted you to think it was. The gladiators Faustina supposedly chose never lived, never died, and never suffered anything worse than death. But Faustina herself has been suffering the death of her reputation for 2 millennia, killed not by blood ritual, but by the slow, steady repetition of lies. That's the real story. That's what's worse than death.